What does the future hold for Kaapo Kakko? Should the Rangers finally give up on the impending RFA and look for a trade, or could they keep him on a team-friendly deal?
You're Locked on the New York Rangers, your daily podcast on the New York Rangers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, Blue Shirts fans, to episode number 1086 of the Locked On New York Rangers podcast. I'm your host, John Chick. Just want to thank you guys, as always, for making Locked On New York Rangers your first listen every day. We are free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. And today's episode of Locked On New York Rangers is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. And we are, of course, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So it is officially the Kaapo Kakko episode here. He, of course, is an impending restricted free agent for the New York Rangers, coming off of a 2-year bridge deal that carried a cap hit of $2.1 million per season. And basically, we're just going to take a look at every, aspect of Kaapo Kakko and his game and what he brings to the table and how things look for the Rangers. Can they, should they, will they look to fit him in under the salary cap going forward with a new contract, or do they cut bait and just get whatever they can for him, maybe restock the draft capital a little bit? We're going to discuss all that. We're going to start with the case for keeping Kaapo Kakko. One of the reasons for me that I wouldn't want to see the Rangers, force a trade of Kaapo Kakko is that you're not going to get that much for him in a trade right now. I really don't know. You're definitely not going to get a first-round pick. I'm not even sure you can get a second-round pick. I mean, I hesitate to say that for sure because, all it takes is one of the other 31 teams, willing to do it. That could make it happen. I don't think the Rangers would trade Kakko in division, so maybe it's not all 31 of the other teams. But, there's 16 teams in the Western Conference. If one of them is willing to give up a second-rounder, that's all it takes, and that's where you send Kakko if indeed you do want to trade him. But again, it would be a classic case of selling low. Now, there might be some people that hear that and think like, well, sell him now, get whatever you can for him. Why keep him around when he keeps, underproducing? And then, his trade value will just continue to go down and down and down and down. For me, though, I'd rather just keep him around. There is always that chance that he could have a breakout season. Some people were getting ready to basically give up on Alexis Lafreniere, and we saw what he did last year, or the season that just concluded here. And of course, just because Lafreniere broke out and reached another level doesn't necessarily mean that it'll happen with Kaapo Kakko. But again, I just can't really justify giving up the former number 2 overall pick for, a third-round pick or, a middling prospect, whatever it might be. That's not worth it. And I do see some Ranger fans, you go on social media, and they're trying to cook up, a trade scenario involving Brady Tkachuk. Now, I'm a big fan of Brady Tkachuk, and obviously I think he could really help this Ranger team. And we will probably this offseason do like an entire episode where we try to come up with some kind of a trade proposal with the Senators that we think would be fair to acquire Brady Tkachuk. But I see Ranger fans throwing out things like, oh, we'll give them, Kaapo Kakko and K'Andre Miller and like a first or second round draft pick. And that's just not going to get it done. That's just not going to be enough for a player the caliber of Brady Tkachuk. You're going to have to really, pony up the dough if you want to even have a chance to land yourself a Brady Tkachuk. And I'm not even so sure the Senators would want to trade him anyway. But I suppose if there's enough of a king's ransom out there for him, they would at least consider it. But as for Kakko, again, getting it back to him here, one of the biggest reasons, again, you're not going to trade him right now is because you just wouldn't be able to get enough for him. Kakko in his career, 300 regular season games, 117 points. I mean, what leg do the Rangers have to stand on in terms of, asking for a first-round pick or asking for like a big-time impact player? I just don't think they have any leg to stand on as it comes to this. So you might be better off just hanging on with him. Another reason not to trade him, and we've said this over and over on this podcast, and it's getting a little bit tiring. Not tiring, but it's just getting to the point where it's like, you want to stop talking about flashes that Kaapo Kakko is showing and talk about him just being a bona fide, rock-solid player in the Ranger lineup. But we haven't gotten to that point yet. But again, over the last half decade here, we have talked about Kaapo Kakko and flashes of strong play. We have seen times where he's picked it up a little bit, gotten on, a little bit of a heater. He'll have stretches where, he'll have like 8 games with 7 points or something along those lines. And you think like, okay, maybe this is it. Maybe he's about to break out. And then, his next 20 games, he'll have like 3 points. And that's just kind of the way it goes with Kaapo Kakko. He just can't quite seem to take that next step or do it consistently enough to make you believe that he really is going to break out. But there are flashes of strong play. And obviously there are times where it looks like, okay, maybe this guy, he's going to find it. And unfortunately, just doesn't really seem to happen. One other reason that I'll throw out here is in terms of why not to trade Kaapo Kakko. We can debate how much this is because of Kakko, and obviously he hasn't been one of the true superstar players on this team, but Kaapo Kakko is part of a Ranger locker room that has a much improved culture from a few years ago. Obviously, they do a heck of a lot more winning than they did, as recently as just 3 seasons ago, and that's got to count for something. And that being the case, I do think Kakko is well-liked in that locker room, and he does have a role on this team. It's just not anywhere near as big of a role as we thought Kaapo Kakko would have by the time that year 5 rolled around for his NHL career. But he has been, a part of some winning here, and, that is a strong locker room and a pretty tight-knit bunch, and I suppose that being the case, you could make an argument to keep him around, partially because of that reason. Something else that I'll say here in support of keeping Kaapo Kakko around, it does seem like Peter Laviolette is still in Kakko's corner based on some of the quotes that he had about Kakko during breakup day. And I do think that of the 3 coaches that have been here since Kaapo Kakko has been a New York Ranger, Peter Laviolette, he's probably in the best hands with Peter Laviolette than he was with either of the other 2 coaches. Laviolette not only spoke highly of Kakko, but he actually took some of the blame as far as Kakko not reaching that level. This is what Laviolette had to say during breakup day. There's responsibility for him too, and what he brings to the table and what he brings to the game. Next year is a new year. I do think that he has the ability to be a top 6 forward. I do think he has the ability to grow off of what he did last year. This year, it did not probably go the way he wanted it to go or the way we wanted it to go. I do think that he can be that player, and that's my job, our job, and his job to get that to happen. Now, on one hand, what else is he going to say, right? He's not going to go up there and bash his own player and, this guy's no good. We got to trade him. He's not going to say anything like that. But that's more of a ringing endorsement that, Kaapo Kakko just got from Peter Laviolette than I think he probably would have gotten from David Quinn or Gerard Gallant. And the fact that, Laviolette puts some of it on himself, I like that too. I do think that if any of these coaches that the Rangers have had while Kakko has been here are going to get the most out of him, it probably, like I said, is Peter Laviolette. And we did see, Alexis Lafreniere, first season under Peter Laviolette, and obviously he took off this year. And again, that's no guarantee that it can or will happen for Kaapo Kakko. But coming into this season, people seemed more bullish in general on Kakko than on Lafreniere. So they were expecting the big breakout season for Kakko. It didn't happen. Could it still happen? I think it's at least possible. You get to year 2 under Peter Laviolette. It is a little bit tricky trying to figure out the lineup because you see all these different ideas and the Rangers should bring in this free agent and this guy should play here and that guy should go there. For me, because I see some people talking about putting Lafreniere with Kreider and Mika, and you could try that. You could break up Kreider and Mika. You got a lot of different options. But to me, that line of Panarin and Trocheck and Lafreniere, they were so good this year that I just don't want to mess with it. Those players I think are capable of playing well with somebody else. But to me, it gets to a point where Kreider and Mika have to figure it out, and they have to figure it out with Kaapo Kakko if he's back next season. Because, we could throw Blake Wheeler up there. I don't think he's going to be back, but, going by this past season, we could throw Blake Wheeler there, Johnny Brodzinski, Jimmy Vesey, Jack Roslovic, who I think will also walk in free agency. The bottom line, Kaapo Kakko is the one with the most upside. Even though he hasn't obviously had the most spectacular start to his career, if one of those guys is going to step up and be a superstar player, or at least getting close to that area, Kakko's the guy. And I just feel like at a certain point, Mika and Kreider have to be able to make it work with Kaapo Kakko. And, every line is give and take. And we could talk about Kakko not doing enough. But, for me, I think if they don't add a big-time right winger and Kakko is back next year, he should be getting the first crack on that line. And like I said, they just got to find a way to make it work. So those are some of the reasons in support of Kakko, the reasons to potentially bring him back next season on a new contract. We're also getting to, in just a second, some of the reasons why the Rangers might want to consider moving on from Kaapo Kakko, moving him in a trade. And then at the end of today's episode, we're going to have a verdict, and I'm going to decide what I would do if I was the GM, which obviously I am not, and also a proposal that I have for, I think, a best case scenario for Kaapo Kakko, the way the Rangers could handle him and what kind of a contract they could give him. We're going to do all that fun stuff in just a second. All right, we just want to take a minute to let everybody know that today's episode of Locked On New York Rangers is brought to you by FanDuel. Summertime means baseball, the NBA Finals, the NHL Finals, and much, much more. And you can bet it all on FanDuel. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 that you can use to bet everything from the Finals MVP to who's going to hit one out of the ballpark. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and add a big win to your summer bucket list. FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. All right, we just want to take a minute to let everybody know that today's episode of Locked On New York Rangers is very much appreciated for all of the everydayers, very appreciative to all the everydayers, I should say. You guys are going to definitely want to stick around this week. On our next episode, very likely going to be talking about something that we briefly mentioned in the aftermath of the season, but we're going to dive into it in a lot more detail, and that is the possibility of a Jacob Trouba buyout. We will discuss, all the financial ramifications and all the ramifications that could happen in the locker room, the benefits, the drawbacks to buying out the Ranger captain. And like I said, we'll do that in our next episode. We'll also have some draft talk going forward, some free agency talk going forward. For right now, though, let's keep the spotlight on Kaapo Kakko. So want to look at the other side of the coin here and look at the case for potentially moving on from Kaapo Kakko in a trade. And I think the biggest reason, the most obvious reason to do that is that ultimately Kaapo Kakko simply has not taken the next step that a lot of us Ranger fans are all hoping and maybe in some cases praying that he would take. For the last couple of years before the one that just happened here, basically for the 2 years before that, when the Rangers got good again and got into the playoffs, one of the things that I kept saying was, man, imagine where this team would be. Imagine how set this squad would be and how good everything would look if the three kids who all had shown flashes of promise and maybe even flashes of greatness in some cases, if all three of Lafreniere and Chytil and Kakko would take that next step. I mean, because the top six was pretty stacked for the Rangers the 2 years before this one going into the playoffs. So, man, if you can get that kid line, rolling and Lafreniere takes a big step forward and Filip Chytil does the same thing and Kaapo Kakko as well, then that's when this Ranger team really becomes no joke. And they've got threats up and down the lineup and as good of a top nine as maybe you would see in hockey. So this past year, we saw Alexis Lafreniere indeed take that next step. And it really looks to me at this point like the sky is the limit for him. There were times throughout this playoff run where I thought he was the best and if nothing else, the most dangerous looking New York Ranger forward. It just felt like there were times where every time he was on the ice, he was a big time threat to score. And I mean, the numbers don't lie either. Obviously, career highs across the board for Alexis Lafreniere, taking full advantage of the chance to play with Artemi Panarin and Vincent Trocheck. Filip Chytil, I mean, obviously he didn't play a whole lot this year. The concussion history being the main reason for that. The year before, though, we got a mini breakout, what I would call a mini breakout for Filip Chytil. I believe 45 points was his total at the end of the season and eclipsed the 20-goal mark, eclipsed the 20-assist mark, and basically doubled his previous career high in points. So we got a mini breakout from Chytil, and then due to circumstances obviously beyond his control this past season, he didn't play a whole lot and only could make so much of an impact once he get back in the playoffs. But he was looking like he might take that next step. With Kaapo Kakko, not so much. I mean, I know that obviously he missed some time due to injury as well. That's obviously part of it. And we can blame Mika and Kreider. I'm sure some fans are definitely going to do that in the comment section. But the bottom line is Kaapo Kakko just did not reach that next plateau, that next threshold where it's looking like, okay, this guy is going to be a big time player. Just never really happened this past season. Got another quote, from Peter Laviolette, kind of talking about Kaapo Kakko here. In my conversation with Kaapo, I took my responsibility in it as a coach. I didn't find it with him. I think he's a good player that we're all hoping would take another step. My responsibility as coach is to unleash these players as well. You hope that happens with all of them, but some it doesn't. I've got to figure out a better way to get him involved. And something else that I noticed about these Laviolette quotes, and you guys probably noticed it as well, is he is talking very much like a coach who absolutely expects Kaapo Kakko to be back next season. And obviously, again, what else is he going to say, right? He's not going to go up there and demand Kakko gets traded or anything along those lines. But it is kind of interesting that Laviolette already looking toward the future with Kaapo Kakko and seems to be looking forward to the challenge of getting him to that next threshold that we just talked about a second ago. With Kakko, though, I said a second ago that he hasn't taken that next step. Really, I mean, you could argue that this past season he regressed, at least as far as point totals are concerned. The year before this one, he had 40 points in 82 games. it's not an enormous total. And, in what was year 4 for the number 2 overall pick, maybe you're hoping for more. But again, career highs pretty much across the board for Kakko. And you're at least starting to believe that he's got it in him. He could, become that player. Then this past year, just 19 points in 61 games. And his stats pretty much went down across the board, including his time on the ice. That was down quite a bit this season as well. With Kakko, it's the same song and dance. What we talked about earlier. There's flashes of great play, and we say things like, well, he's really strong in the puck. He really drives possession. And, there will be some Ranger fans that pound the desk and say he just needs a chance. Well, he got that chance this year in a couple of different stints with Mika Zibanejad and Chris Kreider. However you slice it, Kaapo Kakko did spend considerable time this year on what is the Rangers, really their second line. I mean, it's listed as their top line, but let's be real. The Panarin line is the top line. But he got a lot of time in the top 6 this year, some sustained looks in the top 6, which maybe he hadn't had in the past. And again, just was not able to capitalize on the opportunity. And all these things we say here, when does it eventually lead to at least like modest offensive production? I think it's fair to expect a little bit more after half of a decade than the numbers that Kaapo Kakko is pointing out. Another reason here, as far as, maybe why you could consider trading him, he, as far as Ranger forwards, probably has as little of an impact on special teams as any player on the roster. Everybody else is heavily involved in either the power play or the penalty kill, in some cases both. And Kakko, I mean, there's times where he's on the second power play unit, but they don't really do a whole lot. They get out there for like 30 seconds a shift. And honestly, Kakko had a hard time even hanging on to that role. He's off of the second power play unit, so that guys like Alex Wenberg and Johnny Brodzinski can be out there. Nothing against those players, but those are the guys that are on the second power play in place of Kakko, who, again, the former number 2 overall pick. That's not the prettiest picture right there. And I realize with Wenberg, part of the reason is the other 2 Ranger centers that we put on the power play, Mika and Trocheck, they're both on the top unit. So that's part of the reason why Wenberg is there. But regardless, these are players that are not like superstar players. They're role players. And those are the guys that are getting time on the second power play, at least at times during the playoff run, over Kaapo Kakko. So he doesn't have the special teams value that a lot of other Ranger players do. Basically every other New York Ranger forward. And another reason, I think sometimes, as far as, reason to maybe move on from Kaapo Kakko and trade him, there are times where Kaapo, or certain players, whether it's Kaapo Kakko or anybody else, they simply need a change of scenery. We've seen this throughout hockey, throughout all of sports, really. Sometimes it's just not going to click in a certain spot for a certain player. Now, with that said, Kakko did speak very highly of New York and wasn't sure about his future, if he was going to be here long term, but I mean, he talked about having the chance to win. He talked about, liking his teammates, liking the fans. And I think all of that stuff is very genuine. Kaapo Kakko, to me, does not strike me as somebody that, would ask to be traded, wants to run for the hills, wants to go to maybe a smaller market where there's less pressure. To me, he seems like somebody that wants to be here and wants to figure it out and see this thing all the way through to the end. That's just the impression that I get when he talks in interviews. Doesn't make any excuses. He took full accountability. He said what we were just talking about a couple of minutes ago, that he had a good chance. I think the quote was something like, I can't say that I never had a chance, because he did. He had a couple of different runs with Mika and with Kreider, and by his own admission, it just didn't come together for him on that line this season. But I do believe in, sometimes, regardless of how much he likes New York or anything like that, there are times where players do need a change of scenery. And I also wonder, like, is there somebody else around the league, maybe somebody that was drafted kind of high, maybe like a top 5 or top 10 overall pick from a few years back. Maybe they're the about the same age as Kaapo Kakko, and maybe they're struggling and they're not reaching their full potential. Maybe you could do like a 1-for-1 swap. I think that's an idea that could at least be on the table, or could at least make some sense to explore. I don't know who that player would be. I'd have to do a little bit more research there. An underachieving top 10 overall pick from a few years back that could use a change of scenery, just like Kaapo Kakko, and you just do a 1-for-1 trade and give both guys a change of scenery, and maybe said player could have a little bit more success here than Kaapo Kakko has, at least so far. We're going to keep everything rolling in just a second. I want to shift our attention to the verdict. I'm going to talk about where I stand and what I would do if I was the Ranger GM. Would I hang on to Kaapo Kakko after this season, or would I, look to move him maybe for some draft assets, or, what I just mentioned? Maybe there's a 1-for-1 deal somewhere out there where you can trade Kakko for a similarly underperforming former top 10 overall pick. We will get into all that fun stuff right here on Locked On New York Rangers in just a second. All right, let's go ahead and keep everything rolling here. It's time for the verdict. I'm going to make my decision here, and the Rangers have not asked me for my input, but this is just what I would do, or my thoughts on the whole situation if I am in a position of power with the front office of the New York Rangers. So, first of all, at this point, you can't say that Kaapo Kakko is untouchable. If someone comes knocking with a reasonable offer, and it's, they want to do the one-for-one swap that I just proposed a second ago with another player that has a lot of upside. Maybe there's a guy out there who former top 10 overall pick, and maybe he's a little bit more of a physical player than Kaapo Kakko, somebody that would seem to maybe be a fit, on that top line with Mika and with Kreider. If somebody comes knocking with an offer like that, I think maybe you consider it. But by that same token, I'm certainly not going to give away Kaapo Kakko for next to nothing. If somebody comes to the Rangers and they want to offer a fourth rounder or even a third rounder, go away. It's not worth it. I think at that point, you just ride it out with Kaapo Kakko and you hope for the best next season. But the Rangers, and part of the reason I would not, do that trade for a draft pick, the Rangers are in win now mode. If the Rangers were to trade Kaapo Kakko away for just a third round draft pick, I mean, it's gonna be a while before that guy even comes close to making his NHL debut. And by then, the makeup of the team would be a little bit different. And who knows if the window is even still open at that point, or if we're on to the next, era of New York Ranger hockey. So again, I'm not going to do it just to do it. I will say this though. This is another aspect of Kakko this past season that I thought was really disappointing, because I always talk about going into the Stanley Cup playoffs. It's a whole new season. All bets are off. Everybody kind of goes back to zero in terms of their stats. And I mean, it's win or go home. That's the nature of the beast in the playoffs. And I always talk about how I always think the Stanley Cup playoffs are such an enormous stage for redemption. If there's a player on the Rangers or any team in hockey that did not have a good regular season, maybe has failed to live up to, certain hype that's been around him, whether, that player was drafted recently or came in as a free agent, maybe there's a free agent signing out there that's struggling with his new team. Anybody that just has a lackluster regular season, maybe has people questioning him a little bit, that playoff stage is the place to redeem yourself. And when you look at what Kakko did, he ends up with 2 points in 15 playoff games for the New York Rangers. And in 44 playoff games for the Rangers, he's got a grand total of 9 points. And it was only one game this year, but Kaapo Kakko was a healthy scratch in the playoffs. And that's just not a good sign going forward. It's the second time under two different coaches that he has been a healthy scratch in the Eastern Conference Final. So when you look at all that, it doesn't paint the best picture as far as Kaapo Kakko's future with the Rangers. And again, just a complete lack of production in the Stanley Cup playoffs. My biggest reason might be something that we talk about fairly often on here, because anytime it goes into the offseason and, the Rangers have this free agent and they've got this restricted free agent over here, and what are they going to do? Can they trade this guy? Can they trade for this player over here? Can they afford that going forward? One of the biggest themes for me is that you can't keep everybody. It really is just that simple, that the salary cap is such where there's a lot of difficult decisions to be made. And I can't help but look forward to next year's offseason. And at that time, you're going to need to give out a new contract to Igor Shesterkin and Alexi Lafreniere. And even K'Andre Miller, I wouldn't put him at the same level as Igor or Lafreniere in terms of importance to this team. But K'Andre Miller is somebody that the Rangers might want to hang on to. He might need a new contract at that time. That's three, really important players. And I think all three of those guys are more important to the future of the Rangers, short-term and long-term, than is Kaapo Kakko. And you can't run out of money. You can't not have enough money left in your budget to hang on to an Igor Shesterkin or an Alexi Lafreniere because, we're paying too much money to Kaapo Kakko. And, that being the case, I mean, Kakko is going to get probably somewhere in the $2.5 million range, I believe. His qualifying offer per cap friendly is $2.4 million, and it doesn't sound like a lot. And yeah, the salary cap's going up, and it might go up again next year. But again, I just can't justify, having that money eat into the budget for an Igor Shesterkin or an Alexi Lafreniere. I suppose, next offseason, you could always give Kaapo Kakko away. If he was under contract for another 2-year deal and he plays next season and, okay, we need more money to hang on to Igor or Lafreniere, I mean, you could always trade Kakko away for a bag of pucks or do whatever you got to do to, unload what's left of his contract. But, again, I don't want to see a situation where the Rangers can't do certain things that they need to do because they're giving too much money to Kaapo Kakko. The official verdict here, though, in a perfect world for me, this is what I would do with Kaapo Kakko. I would try to get him re-signed for a 1-year deal. And again, his qualifying offer per cap friendly is $2.4 million. I think that's a reasonable number for Kakko if you're still, into, upside and whatnot. The risky thing about a 1-year deal, though, is you could end up, like, if Kakko does go off next year, if he does have a really good season, if he does have the best season of his NHL career, then you're kind of in a tough spot going into next year's offseason because, well, this guy just had his best season ever. He needs a raise too. And then you've got, if you want to hang on to Kakko at that point, you got to figure out a way to re-sign Kakko and Lafreniere and Igor and K'Andre Miller. Good luck with that. That would be a very difficult thing to do. But I still think in my perfect world, the Rangers get Kakko to a 1-year deal. A couple of reasons here. First of all, you're not overcommitting. Obviously, it's only a 1-year deal. There's a saying in sports sometimes that you hear where there's no such thing as a bad 1-year contract. I don't 100% agree with that because if you sign somebody to a 1-year deal and they're terrible, then that doesn't really help your team. But I get where that idea comes from because there's no long-term commitment. And if it doesn't go well, it doesn't go well. You say goodbye the next offseason. So there's that. I also think that, again, the 1-year deal, it would not affect at all your ability to re-sign Igor Shesterkin, Alexis Lafreniere, and even somebody like K'Andre Miller the following offseason. Because if you only re-sign Kakko for a 1-year deal, and then maybe he walks, or maybe you trade him after this upcoming season, if he's at that point an ex-Ranger, then that's fine, and he's gone, and his money's off the books, and you are no longer, handcuffed by, whatever salary you might be paying him when it comes to, once again, re-signing an Igor Shesterkin and Alexis Lafreniere or K'Andre Miller. So I think it's fine to bring him back. I mean, he does have a role for this team. It's not nearly as big of a role or even the type of a role that we thought he would end up playing for the Rangers when the Rangers, lucked out in the draft lottery and got to pick number 2 that year and went with Kaapo Kakko. So that being the case, yeah, I don't see a ton of harm in bringing him back for 1 more year. It depends what else the Rangers are looking to do. Do they have their eyes on this free agent or that free agent? If that's the case, then maybe you do flip him for a draft pick. But as far as draft picks are concerned, like I said a second ago, I'm not doing it for any less than a 2nd rounder. A 3rd rounder, I mean, I can't even say a 3rd for Kaapo Kakko would be an unfair offer by another team, but I'm still not going to do it if I'm the Rangers. I'd rather hang on to Kakko, see what he can do next year. Maybe it's finally his time to shine, and I'm not going to cut bait on him for just a 3rd rounder. So that's my thoughts on it. Again, in perfect world for me, give me Kaapo Kakko back next year with the Rangers, but only on a 1-year deal. So that way you don't have to overcommit to him in terms of length of the contract, in terms of financials of the contract. And again, it doesn't handcuff you from re-signing other and frankly more important free agents, guys like Igor Lafreniere and K'Andre Miller the following offseason. So that's my perfect scenario. Figure we can pretty much call it there. I did want to mention that if you guys have any questions, any topic you would like me to cover on here, any idea of what the Rangers need, a certain trade target you'd like them to go after, a certain, free agent you'd like them to pursue, or a certain player on the Rangers that you'd like traded away, definitely send me an email or DM me on Twitter. We're going to do a mailbag episode sometime in the future here. We've heard from a couple of you guys already, and it'd be great to get a couple of more. We're also going to continue covering Ranger free agents, UFAs, and RFAs just like this. Not every free agent is going to get his own episode, but I think we'll do for both Ryan Lindgren and Braden Schneider. They're obviously very important parts of this team. They'll probably get their own episode, and then some of the UFAs and the minor league free agents, we'll kind of mix them together all into one episode. But we're going to take our time, give everybody a fair trial. One other bit of news here is that Mark Messier has signed a multi-year contract extension with ESPN. And I've mentioned that, I do think at times to put it in as nice of a way as I possibly can, ESPN's hockey coverage does leave something to be desired, but I do like Messier in the studio, and maybe I'm a little bit Ranger biased. Obviously, he was here and delivered the Stanley Cup in '94, but overall, I think he does a good job there, and I think that's a great choice, and he's obviously very knowledgeable and still seems very passionate about the game of hockey. One thing that I really like about Messier is, you get so many of those analysts, and whether it's football or, baseball, whatever it might be, they honestly give the impression that they absolutely hate the modern game. And Messier, he'll talk about the way things were back when he played, but I never get the sense from him that he's disgusted with, anything going on in the current NHL. It's just a little thing, but it's something that I appreciate. There's other announcers and analysts that basically are constantly telling you how much today's game sucks. And I don't want to hear that. There's certain baseball announcers that definitely do that. And John Smoltz, let's just say it. It's John Smoltz. Always complaining about, just how much everything isn't as good as it was when he played. I don't want to hear it. I enjoy baseball. I enjoy old school baseball. I like the new school as well. And it's the same thing with hockey. And like I said, Mark Messier does not do anything to discredit modern NHL. He'll talk about how things were back in the day, but he's also very passionate and, just very knowledgeable about today's game as well. And I appreciate that. It's the little things sometimes. But yeah, figure we could pretty much call it there. If you guys would like to get in touch with this podcast, please send an email to lockedonnyrangers@gmail.com. Once again, that is lockedonnyrangers@gmail.com. Definitely give us a follow on Twitter as well, at @LO_NY_Rangers. Once again, that's at @LO_NY_Rangers. And definitely subscribe to Locked On New York Rangers YouTube channel. Thanks again, guys. I will see you next time.